Before we begin, I ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you these untold stories of the famous. The smell of gunpowder and diesel fuel hung thick in the desert air as I stood at the edge of what would become my greatest test. It was July 1991, and I was deep into filming Terminator 2, Judgment Day at the Palmdale Airport. The sun was beating down mercilessly on the runway, turning the asphalt into shimmering waves of heat. James Cameron approached me with that look, the one his crew had learned to fear. His eyes were focused, calculating, like an engineer who had just solved an equation everyone else thought was impossible. "Arnold, I need to ask you something," he said, pulling me aside from the main crew. "Something that's going to sound insane." I followed his gaze toward the massive Freightliner truck that our special effects team had been modifying in secret. 18 wheels of American steel, now equipped with hydraulic systems designed to launch the entire cab skyward. Beside it sat a Harley-Davidson Fat Boy, chrome gleaming like a mirror in the desert sun. "The shot I want requires perfect timing," Cameron explained, showing me storyboards that looked more like engineering schematics than film plans. "The truck launches into the air. You ride the Harley underneath at the exact moment of maximum elevation." I studied the drawings. The physics were brutal but theoretically sound. The truck airborne for maybe 2 seconds, the motorcycle threading through that gap at highway speed. The margin for error was measured in milliseconds, not seconds. "What did Tommy say?" I asked, referring to our head stunt coordinator. Cameron's expression told me everything. He said it could work. Emphasis on could. Tommy Fletcher materialized beside us, a man whose resume included every death-defying stunt of the past decade. But when I looked into his weathered face, I saw something unfamiliar, genuine uncertainty. "The math checks out, boss," Tommy said quietly. "Every component has been tested. The hydraulics, the launch trajectory, the timing mechanisms. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "this isn't like jumping a car through a window. One mechanical hiccup, one split-second delay in your reaction time, and there's no safety net." No safety net. In a business built on calculated risks and carefully orchestrated danger, those 3 words carried unusual weight. I walked over to the Harley, running my hands along its handlebars. The metal was scorching from the desert heat. This machine would be my partner in what was essentially a high-speed dance with physics. Every component functioning flawlessly, every calculation proven correct, every instinct razor-sharp. As I studied the bike, my father's voice echoed in my mind, spoken years ago in his harsh Austrian accent. "You are a dreamer, Arnold, and dreamers end up broken." Gustav Schwarzenegger had been a police chief who believed in rules and safe boundaries. He had looked at his son's American dreams, bodybuilding, Hollywood, fame, with the same skepticism I now saw reflected in the faces around me. But those dreams had carried me from a basement gym in Graz to 7 Mr. Olympia titles, from broken English to blockbuster stardom. The question was, had I finally found the boundary I shouldn't cross? Linda Hamilton appeared at my elbow, still in her Sarah Connor gear. "You know," she said softly, "there's no shame in letting the stunt team figure out another way. Computer effects, miniatures, creative editing, there are options." She was right. I had already achieved more than that immigrant kid from Austria had ever dared imagine. I had a wife I adored, children who needed their father, a career that had exceeded every fantasy. What more did I need to prove? But that was the problem. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about who I had always been. Every major moment of my life had come down to a choice between the safe path and the uncertain one. When doctors said my frame was wrong for bodybuilding, I trained harder. When casting directors said my accent would limit me to villain roles, I redefined what a leading man could be. When everyone assumed an Austrian bodybuilder could never carry a major Hollywood film, I made them rewrite the rules. Cameron called for final systems checks, and I watched the crew swarm over both vehicles like surgeons preparing for the most complex operation of their careers. Every hydraulic line was tested and retested. Every camera angle was precisely measured. Every emergency protocol was rehearsed. The truck's engine roared to life, a deep mechanical growl that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. This wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a precisely engineered projectile designed to achieve controlled flight while carrying thousands of pounds of camera equipment. As the desert sun began its descent, painting long shadows across the runway, I realized this moment represented something larger than a single stunt. This was about every choice that had brought me from Thal, Austria, to this runway in California. The bodybuilder who had refused to accept genetic limitations. The immigrant who had turned broken English into a trademark. The actor who had made audiences believe a machine could learn to be human. But it was also about the husband who had promised Maria he would always come home safely. The father whose children deserved to grow up with their dad present, not just in their memories. Maria's face flashed in my mind. Her smile when I walked through the door each evening. Her laugh when the kids climbed all over me during our weekend wrestling matches. Her unspoken trust that I would always choose family over everything else. The internal calculation was swift but thorough. Everything rational demanded I step aside, find another way, think about everyone who depended on me. But everything that had made me Arnold Schwarzenegger whispered that backing down now would betray the very core of who I was. "We're ready when you are," Cameron announced, his voice cutting through the desert wind. I looked once more at the Harley, then at the truck, then at the camera's position to capture what would either become cinema history or a cautionary tale about the price of ambition. The entire crew had gone silent. Every eye focused on me, waiting. I swung my leg over the Harley's seat and felt the engine's power vibrating through the machine and into my body. The bike was responsive, alive, perfectly tuned. But as I gripped the handlebars, I felt something else, the weight of a decision that would define everything that came after. "Rolling!" Cameron shouted, and suddenly the world erupted into controlled chaos. Camera's word to life. The truck's hydraulics engaged with a mechanical scream, and the Freightliner began building speed for its impossible leap. I gunned the Harley's engine, feeling all 1,340 pounds of steel and chrome respond instantly. The runway stretched ahead, and at the end of it waited the most dangerous 2 seconds of my life. The truck was accelerating now, committed to its launch trajectory. In 25 seconds, it would bareboard directly above the point where I would be traveling at 60 miles per hour. There was no hesitation now, no more time for doubt. I released the clutch and shot forward, the Harley's engine screaming as we rocketed toward Arendesvis that would either prove that some dreams are worth any risk, or that my father had been right about dreamers all along. The world collapsed into pure sensation. Wind screaming past my helmet, engine roaring beneath me, asphalt blurring into gray streaks as the speedometer climbed past 55. 60 miles per hour. The Harley was perfectly balanced, responding to every micro-adjustment of my body weight. But ahead off me, the Freightliner was reaching its launch point, hydraulics primed, 18 wheels of steel committed to defying gravity for exactly 2.3 seconds. I could see Cameron in my peripheral vision, pressed against his monitor, headset clamped to his ears. His lips were moving, counting down, but his words were lost in the mechanical symphony of engines and hydraulics and rushing air. The truck hit its mark. For a split second, physics hesitated. The massive Freightliner seemed to pause mid-stride, like a sprinter gathering for the leap of their life. Then the hydraulics exploded into action, launching 20 tons of American steel skyward in a trajectory that would either clear my path or crush me into the runway. I was committed now. No brakes, no escape route, no room for hesitation. The Harley and I were locked in partnership with momentum itself. The truck's shadow fell across me like a solar eclipse, and suddenly I was riding through a tunnel off darkness. Above my head, close enough to touch if I raised my hand, the Freightliner's undercarriage streaked past in a blur of axles and exhaust pipes and spinning wheels. Time fractured. Milliseconds stretched into hours. I could count the bolts in the truck's frame, see individual droplets of oil catching the desert sun, feel the heat radiating from the engine block just inches from my helmet. Then the wind hit. A crosswind that hadn't been there moments before, just a desert breeze, nothing the meteorologists had flagged, but enough to push the Harley 3 inches to the right. 3 inches toward the truck's rear axle, which was descending now, committed to its landing trajectory, whether I was clear or not. I felt the handlebars twitch in my grip. The bike's front wheel wobbled for a fraction of a second that felt like eternity. My heart stopped beating. My lungs stopped working. Every muscle in my body tensed as I fought to hold the line, to keep the Harley true to its path while 20 tons of falling steel passed overhead. The truck's rear bumper cleared my helmet by maybe 4 inches. Maybe 3. I shot out from under the Freightliner's shadow like a bullet leaving a barrel, the desert sun suddenly blazing in my eyes, the wind no longer blocked by the truck's massive bulk. Behind me, I heard the thunderous crash as the Freightliner slammed back onto the runway, hydraulics screaming in protest, cameras shaking on their mounts. But I was clear, alive, still moving at 60 miles per hour down a runway that suddenly felt infinite. I squeezed the brakes, feeling the Harley's weight shift forward as we decelerated. My hands were shaking now, not from fear but from the adrenaline that was flooding my system like a drug. Every nerve ending was on fire. Every sense was hypertuned. I could smell my own sweat, taste the metallic tang of adrenaline, feel my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I brought the Harley to a stop and sat there for a moment, engine idling, trying to process what had just happened. The desert stretched out ahead of me, empty and peaceful, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But behind me, I could hear the sound of footsteps running across asphalt. Jesus Christ, Arnold. Tommy reached me first, his face pale beneath his tan. He grabbed my shoulders and looked me over like he a medic checking for injuries. Are you okay? Are you hurt? Talk to me. I pulled off my helmet, and the desert air hit my face like a splash of cold water. I'm fine, I said. Thuff-me voice sounded strange to my own ears, hoarse from the wind and the adrenaline. I'm good, but I wasn't good. I was something else entirely, something I couldn't quite name. Cameron appeared next, his face a mixture of triumph and disbelief. Did we get it? I asked him. He nodded, his eyes wide. We got it. Every angle, every frame. He paused, studying my face. That crosswind wasn't in the forecast. I know. You handled it perfectly. I know, but did I? Or had I just gotten lucky? The line between skill and chance was thinner than the gap between me helmet and that truck's bumper. Linda Hamilton was there now, shaking her head in what looked like equal parts admiration and disbelief. You're insane, she said simply. Completely insane. The crew began gathering around us, their faces reflecting the same mixture of awe and shock I'd seen after my biggest bodybuilding victories. But this was different. In bodybuilding, I had been pushing my own limits, risking only my own dreams. Here, I'd been gambling with something infinitely more precious. I thought about Maria, probably at home with our children, trusting that their father would come back safely. I thought about Catherine and Christina, too young to understand what Daddy did for work, but old enough to know when he wasn't there for dinner. As the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, I realized something that unsettled me more than the near miss with the truck. The stunt was over. The cameras had stopped rolling. The immediate danger was past. But I wasn't satisfied. Even now, sitting on this Harley in the middle of the desert, having just survived what should have been the most terrifying experience of my life, part of my mind was already racing ahead. What would be the next challenge? What new boundary could I push? What impossible thing could I attempt that no one had ever attempted before? It was a hunger that had driven me from Austria to America, from bodybuilding to movies for Nobodido somebody. But it was also a hunger that seemed incapable of being satisfied, no matter how much E fed it. Cameron was already talking about additional shots, different angles, ways to build on what we had just captured. The crew was breaking down equipment and setting up for the next sequence. The machine of movie-making was already moving forward, consuming the moment we had just created and demanding more. I stood up from the Harley and looked back down the runway toward where the truck had landed. Skid marks scored the asphalt in 2 parallel lines, evidence of the controlled violence we had just orchestrated. In a few hours, those marks would be swept away, the runway returned to its normal function. But the footage would remain, preserved forever, Proof that the impossible was just another word for something no one had attempted yet. Tommy appeared at my elbow, still shaking his head. In 30 years of stunt work, he said quietly, I've never seen anything like that. The precision, the timing, the way you corrected for that wind. He trailed off, then looked at me directly. But Arnold, promise me something. What's that? Promise me that was a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Because I don't think my heart can take watching you dose-a-mething like that again. I clapped him on the shoulder and managed to smile. Don't worry, Tommy. Lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place. But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. Because the truth was simpler and more frightening. E was the lightning, and I had been striking in the same place my entire life, at the intersection of ambition and impossibility, where the only choice was between everything and nothing. The stunt was over. The movie would be completed. The audiences would cheer. The box office would break records. But the real question remained unanswered. What happens to a man who has built his entire identity around refusing to accept limits, when those limits are the only thing standing between him and destruction? As I walked back toward the crew, the desert sun setting behind me, I carried that question with me like a weight I couldn't put down. Because somewhere deep inside, I already knew that this wouldn't be the last time I would have to choose between the safe path and the impossible one. And I already knew which path I would choose. The house was quiet when I got home that night. Too quiet. Maria had put the children to bed hours earlier, and she was waiting for me in the living room of our Pacific Palisades home, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The soft glow of table lamps cast gentle shadows across the walls, a stark contrast to the harsh desert sun that had been beating down on me just hours before. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see the relief in her eyes. But there was something else there, too, something that made my stomach tighten in a way the truck stunt never had. How did it go? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Good. We got the shot. I sat down beside her on the couch, the familiar comfort of home feeling strangely foreign after the intensity of the day. Cameron's thrilled. Says it might be the greatest action sequence ever filmed. Maria nodded, but she wasn't really listening. Her eyes were studying my face, searching for something I wasn't sure I wanted her to find. Arnold, she said quietly. Linda called. My heart stopped. Linda Hamilton wouldn't call Maria unless something had gone seriously wrong, or unless she was worried about something that was about to go seriously wrong. She told me what you did today. About the truck. Maria set down her teacup with a soft clink that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She said she watched you almost die. I reached for her hand, but she pulled it away, not angrily, but with a kind of exhaustive finality that was worse than anger. Maria, you have to understand. No, I don't. Her voice was still quiet, but there was steel beneath it now. I don't have to understand why my husband, the father of my children, thinks it's acceptable to risk his life for a movie. It wasn't that dangerous. The calculations. Stop. She stood up, pacing to the window that looked out over our backyard, where Catherine's swing set sat empty in the moonlight. Just stop with the calculations and the engineering reports and all of it. Linda said there was a moment where she thought you were going to die. A moment where everyone thought you were going to die. I wanted to argue, to explain about the precision, the safety measures, the professional stunt team. But the words died in my throat because I knew she was right. There had been that moment, when the wind hit, when the Harley wobbled, when 20 tons of steel passed inches from my head, where death hadn't been a statistical possibility but a physical reality. What am I supposed to tell Catherine and Christina? Maria continued, her reflection ghostly in the window glass. That Daddy died doing something brave? That it was for his art? That it was important for the movie? You don't have to tell them anything because nothing happened. She turned around then, and I saw something in her face I had never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of cold assessment that reminded me uncomfortably of my father. This time, she said, nothing happened this time. The words hung between us like a challenge, because we both knew this wouldn't be the last time. There would be another movie, another director, another impossible stunt that no one else would attempt. There would always be another line to cross. I can't turn it off, Maria. The admission came out before I could stop it. This thing inside me that needs to push further to do what everyone says can't be done. I've tried, but I can't turn it off. Then maybe, she said softly, you need to learn how. She kissed me goodnight and went upstairs, leaving me alone with the weight of her words and the echo of her footsteps on the hardwood floors. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to Maria's breathing beside me, staring at the ceiling and replaying the stunt over and over in my mind. Not the triumph of it, not the adrenaline rush or Cameron's ecstatic reaction, but that single moment when the wind pushed me toward the truck's axle and I felt the cold breath of mortality on my neck. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went down to my home gym. The familiar weight of iron in my hands usually brought clarity, but tonight every rep felt hollow. I found myself thinking about my father, about all the times he had accused me of being reckless, of taking unnecessary risks, of never knowing when to stop. Maybe he'd been right all along. The next day brought a storm of industry reaction. The footage from the stunt had leaked somehow, probably through one of the camera operators, and by noon, every entertainment news show in America was running the clip. The phone didn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Talk shows wanted appearances. The studio executives were simultaneously thrilled by the publicity and terrified by its liability. Schwarzenegger death-defying stunt sets new standard for action cinema, read one headline. Is Arnold going too far? Asked another. Cameron called me around lunchtime, his voice crackling with excitement. Arnold, you've seen the coverage, right? This is exactly what we needed. The audience is going to lose their minds when they see this in theaters. Jim, about what happened yesterday. What about it? It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. In fact, I've been thinking about ways we can top it for next film. Maybe something with helicopters or... Jim, I cut him off. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course. When you saw me almost get clipped by that truck, what did you think? There was a pause. I thought we were about to lose you. And what did you feel? Another pause, longer this time. I felt like we were about to capture something no one had ever captured before. The honesty of it hit me like a physical blow, because I realized that in that moment, I had felt the same thing. Not fear for my life, not concern for my family, but excitement about the footage we were getting. What did that make us? Arnold, Cameron's voice brought me back to the present. You still there? Yeah, I'm here. Good. Because I've got some ideas for the next sequence that I think you're going to love. I hung up without answering. That afternoon, I met with my agent and publicist at their Beverly Hills office. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Mahogany conference tables and leather chairs replacing the desert runway, bottled water instead of diesel fumes, but the energy was just as intense. The studio is concerned, my agent said without preamble. Thrilled about the publicity, but concerned about the precedent. They're asking if you're going to require this level of authenticity in future projects. Are they worried about me getting hurt? They're worried about insurance costs and liability. And what happens to their $100 million investment if their star decides to play chicken with a freight truck? My publicist leaned forward. Arnold, the coverage has been incredible, but some of the commentary is starting to shift. Entertainment Tonight ran a segment asking if action stars have a responsibility to their families to avoid unnecessary risks. Extra is doing a piece on the psychological profile of risk takers. What are they saying? They're asking if there's a line between dedication to craft and, well, addiction to danger. Addiction. The word stuck in my throat like a bone. Because the truth was, I had been thinking about that truck stunt constantly since it happened. Not just the memory of it, but the hunger for the next one. The need to find something even more challenging, even more impossible. Was that dedication or addiction? I drove home through the winding roads of the Palisades, past the manicured lawns and perfect families living their perfect lives behind their perfect gates. When I pulled into my driveway, I could see Catherine and Christina playing in the backyard, their laughter carrying through the evening air like music. Maria was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see her taking inventory, checking for new bruises, new cuts, new evidence of whatever madness I might have committed that day. Quiet day at the office? She asked. studio meeting, press calls, and everyone wants to know what I'm going to do next. She nodded, but didn't ask the obvious follow-up question. Maybe because she was afraid of the answer. Maybe because she already knew it. That night, after the children were asleep, I found myself standing in Catherine's doorway, watching her sleep. She looked so small, so fragile, so completely dependent on the idea that her father would always be there to protect her. Her room was filled with stuffed animals and picture books and all the innocent debris of a life that hadn't yet learned that some risks aren't worth taking. Was I teaching her by example that safety was for other people? That the only way to prove yourself was to risk everything? That fathers were expendable as long as their death made good television? Or was I teaching her that dreams were worth fighting for? That impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet? That she should never let anyone tell her she couldn't dosimethamphetamine just because it was dangerous? I honestly didn't know anymore. As I stood there in the darkness, listening to my daughter's peaceful breathing, I felt the familiar stirring in my chest, that restless energy that had driven me from Austria to America, from bodybuilding to movies, from anonymous to iconic. But for the first time in my life, instead of embracing it, I found myself wondering what would happen if I tried to ignore it. What would happen if Arnold Schwarzenegger learned to say no? The question followed me to bed, haunted my dreams, and was still there when I woke up the next morning. Because somewhere deep inside, I already knew the answer. I was about to find out whether the man who had built his entire life on refusing to accept limits could survive learning to live with them. And the test was coming sooner than I thought. The test came 3 weeks later, and it came from the sky. Cameron had been unusually quiet during the morning briefing, which should have been my first warning. When James Cameron went quiet, it meant he was planning something that would either revolutionize cinema or kill someone. Usually both. We were back at Palmdale Airport, but this time the runway was clear except for a single helicopter, a modified Bell UH, one Huey that looked like it had been stripped down to its mechanical skeleton and rebuilt for war. Mounted cameras bristled from every angle like weapon systems. The pilot, a Vietnam veteran named Chuck Tamburo, was doing his final systems check with the methodical precision of a man who knew that mistakes at altitude weren't survivable. The shot is simple, Cameron explained, but his eyes betrayed the lie. Nothing was ever simple when he used that tone. The T-1000 commandeers a helicopter. The Terminator, needs to stop it. But not from the ground. From the air. I studied the storyboards he handed me. They showed a figure, clearly meant to be me, leaping from one helicopter to another mid-flight, 50 feet above the desert floor. Jim, I said carefully, please tell me this is going to be done with miniatures and green screen. His smile was answer enough. Where's the authenticity in that? The audience can always tell when it's fake. They need to believe it's really you up there, really risking everything. Tommy Fletcher appeared at my elbow, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. Arnold, weave Eric's safety cables that should keep you from falling to your death if you miss the jump. But a margin for error. He shook his head. The helicopters will be flying formation at 60 miles per hour, maintaining a 10-foot separation. You'll have maybe 2 seconds to make the leap before the gap widens beyond reach. 2 seconds. At 50 feet altitude, with nothing but desert hardpan below. What about the insurance company? I asked. Cameron's expression darkened. What they don't know won't hurt them. Officially, this is being done with a stuntman and clever editing. Unofficially, he gestured toward the sky. This is your chance to create the greatest action sequence in cinema history. Something no one else would dare attempt. It was that word again. Dare. It hit the same nerve it always hit, the one connected directly to every childhood taunt, every dismissive comment, every person who had ever said Arnold Schwarzenegger can do something. But standing there in the desert morning, with the Huey's rotors beginning their lazy warm-up rotation, I felt something different. Not the familiar fire of competitive rage, but something colder. A calculation that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with survival. I thought about Maria's face 3 weeks ago, about the way she had looked at me when she said, "This time, nothing happened." I thought about Catherine and Christina, probably eating breakfast at home right now, trusting that Daddy would come home for dinner. Jim, maybe we should... Arnold, his voice cut through my hesitation like a blade. You've spent your entire life refusing to accept the word impossible. Are you really going to start now? The challenge hung in the air between us, and I felt the familiar stirring in my chest. The hunger that had carried me from Austria to America, from unknown to icon, from nothing to everything. But this time, something else stirred too. A small voice that sounded disturbingly like my wife. I ignored it. 30 minutes later, I was strapped into the first helicopter, safety harness hidden beneath my Terminator costume, the desert shrinking away beneath us as we climbed altitude. Through my headset, I could hear Cameron's voice crackling with excitement as he coordinated with the camera operators in both aircraft. Remember, this is a one-take shot, he said. We can't afford multiple attempts. The fuel costs alone would bankrupt us, and Chuck says the wind patterns are only going to hold for another hour. I looked across the 10-foot gap separating our helicopter from the second Huey. 10 feet might as well have been 10 miles when you were 50 feet off the ground and traveling at highway speed. The target helicopter's open cargo door seemed impossibly small, a rectangle of darkness that I would need to hit perfectly or plummet to the desert floor. Chuck's voice came through the headset. Arnold, you feeling good about this? Because once we commit to the approach, there's no aborting. These birds don't stop on a dime. I'm ready, I heard myself say, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Camera speeds, Cameron's voice announced. Action in 30 seconds. I moved to the cargo door and gripped the frame, wind whipping in my leather jacket, the ground a brown blur below. The second helicopter held formation beside us, its rotor wash creating turbulence that made our aircraft buck and shake like a living thing. 10 seconds, Cameron counted down. Remember, commit fully to the jump. Hesitation will kill you. 5 seconds. The gap between helicopters seemed to widen and narrow with each gust of wind, a constantly shifting target that required split-second timing. 3 seconds. I could see the camera operator in the target helicopter, his lens trained on me, waiting to capture either triumph or disaster. 1 second. Jump. I launched myself into space. For a moment, I was flying, completely unsupported, 50 feet above the desert, with nothing but momentum carrying me across the gap between aircraft. The world reduced to wind and noise and the rapidly approaching cargo door of the second helicopter. Then the wind hit. A desert thermal, invisible and unpredictable, caught me mid-flight and pushed me 6 inches off course. 0.6 inches that meant the difference between landing safely in the cargo bay and missing entirely. I stretched my arms forward, fingers grasping for anything solid, and felt my right hand catch the edge of the helicopter's door frame. My left hand missed completely. My legs swung out into empty air, and suddenly I was hanging by one arm from a helicopter traveling 60 miles per hour. The safety cable attached to my harness went taut with a jolt that nearly dislocated my shoulder, but it felled. Barely. I could feel the webbing stretching under my weight. Hear the metal clips groaning with strain they weren't designed to handle. Chuck's voice exploded through the headset. Jesus Christ, he's hanging off the side. I'm bringing us down. No. Cameron's voice cut through the static. Hold formation. Keep rolling. Hanging there by one arm, my legs kicking at nothing but air, I understood with perfect clarity that I was about to die. Not from the fall. The safety cable would probably prevent that, but from being dragged at 60 miles per hour across the desert floor when the helicopter descended. The wind was tearing at my jacket, my hair, my face. My right arm was screaming in pain, the muscles cramping from the strain of supporting my entire body weight. Below me, the desert rushed past in a brown blur that would soon become my grave. Arnold, the voice in my headset wasn't Cameron's. It was Linda Hamilton, who must have been monitoring from the ground. The cable is stretching. You have maybe 30 seconds before it snaps. 30 seconds. I looked up at the helicopter's cargo door just 18 inches above my head, but might as well have been on the moon. My right hand was starting to slip, sweat, and wind, making it impossible to maintain my grip. This was it. This was the moment I had been racing toward my entire life. The intersection of ambition and physics, where the only choices were impossible success or certain death. With every ounce of strength I had left, I swung my left arm up and grabbed for the door frame. Missed. Tried again. This time my fingers caught metal, and I pulled myself up with a desperation that came from somewhere deeper than muscle memory. I hauled myself into the cargo bay just as the safety cable snapped. I lay there on the helicopter's floor, gasping for air, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through the open door, I could see the broken cable falling toward the desert like a dead snake. Cut! Cameron's voice crackled through the headset, electric with excitement. That was incredible, absolutely incredible. The camera caught everything, the miss, the save, the cable snapping. This is going to be legendary. But I wasn't listening to Cameron anymore. I was listening to something else, the absolute silence in my own head where the hunger used to be. For the first time in my adult life, that restless energy that had driven me from Austria to America, from bodybuilding to movies, from safety to danger, had gone completely quiet. Because I had finally found the line. Not the line between possible and impossible. I had been crossing that one my entire life. This was different. This was the line between living for something and dying for nothing. Chuck set the helicopter down on the runway with the gentleness of a mother putting a baby to sleep. When the rotors finally stopped spinning, the silence was deafening. Cameron was the first to reach me, his face flushed with triumph. Arnold, that was the greatest stunt in cinema history. The way you saved yourself, the cable snapping at the perfect dramatic moment. We couldn't have scripted it better. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something that chilled me more than hanging from that helicopter had. In his eyes, I saw the same hunger that had been driving me my entire life. The same refusal to accept limits. The same willingness to risk everything for the sake of something that existed only on film. Jim, I said quietly, I need you to destroy that footage. His face went blank. What? The footage. Destroy it. All of it. Arnold, you can't be serious. That's the greatest. I'm dead serious. I stood up, my legs still shaky from adrenaline. That cable wasn't supposed to snap. If it had happened 30 seconds earlier, you would have footage of me being dragged to death across the desert floor. Is it the kind of cinema history you want to make? Cameron stared at me like I had just suggested burning down Hollywood. But the authenticity nearly killed me. And for what? So audiences can see something that's never been done before? So you can push the boundaries of what's possible. I shook my head. There are some boundaries that exist for a reason, Jim, and I just found one of them. I walked away from him, then, away from the helicopters and the cameras and the crew who were all staring at me like I had lost my mind. Maybe I had, or maybe I had finally found it. My phone was ringing. Maria's number. Arnold. Her voice was tight with worry. Linda called. She said something went wrong with the helicopter stunt. I closed my eyes and felt the desert wind on my face, carrying the scent of sage and dust and possibility, but not infinite possibility. Not anymore. Something went right. I told her. Something finally went right. What do you mean? I mean, I'm coming home, and I'm going to stay there. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long I thought we had been disconnected. When Maria finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. Promise me, she said. I promise. And for the first time in my life, I meant it. The first thing I noticed when I walked through my front door that evening was the smell of Catherine Strawberry's shampoo lingering in the hallway. She had left her backpack by the stairs. One small sneaker kicked off carelessly near the coat closet. These tiny details of domestic life, details I had rushed past 1,000 times before in my hurry to get to the next challenge, the next mountain to climb, suddenly seemed precious beyond measure. Maria was in the kitchen, not cooking, but simply standing at the counter with her hands pressed flat against the marble surface. When she heard my footsteps, she turned around, and I saw my own transformation reflected in her eyes. Something fundamental had shifted in the space between hanging from that helicopter and walking through this door. The children are asleep, she said softly. Good. I moved toward her slowly, like a man learning to walk in his own house. Maria, I need to tell you something. She waited, patient as always, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was bracing herself for whatever confession was coming. Today I almost died, I said. Really died. Not movie danger, not calculated risk, actual death. And in that moment, hanging 50 feet above the desert, you know what I thought about? She shook her head. Not the movie, not the stunt, not proving anything to anyone. I reached for her hands. I thought about Catherine asking where Daddy was. I thought about Christina growing up with just photographs. It thought about you having to explain to them why their father chose a 2-second shot in a movie over the rest of their lives. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She knew this was something I needed to say completely. I've spent 44 years of my life refusing to accept the word impossible. I continued. It made me Mr. Olympia. It got me to America. It gave me a career in Hollywood that no one thought an Austrian bodybuilder could have. But today, I learned something else. There's a difference between impossible and unnecessary. And I've been crossing that line without even knowing it existed. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat in Catherine's room and simply watched her sleep. Her breathing was soft and regular, her small hand curled around a stuffed elephant that had seen better days. She looked so trusting, so certain that her world was safe because the adults around her were making smart choices. I thought about the footage Cameron had shot, the images of me hanging from that helicopter by one arm, the safety cable snapping just seconds after I pulled myself to safety. He would find a way to use it, I knew. He would edit it, enhance it, turn it into cinema gold. The audience would cheer. The critics would praise the authenticity. The stunt would become legend. But they would never know how close they came to watching a man die for their entertainment. The next morning brought the inevitable phone calls. Cameron first, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Arnold, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about destroying the footage. I understand you were shaken up, but... Jim, I cut him off gently but firmly. The footage stays locked away. Forever. But the sequence could revolutionize. It could have killed me. That's not revolution. That's Russian roulette. There was a long pause. So what are you saying? That you're done with stunts entirely? Because if that's the case, we need to completely restructure the rest of the shoot. I looked out my kitchen window at Catherine and Christina playing in the backyard, their laughter carrying through the morning air like the sound of everything that mattered. I'm saying I'm done with unnecessary stunts. Done with risking my life for footage. You want authenticity? Hire the best stunt doubles money can buy and get creative with your camera work. That's what you're supposed to be good at. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to remembered in Hollywood circles. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man who never backed down from anything, had finally found his limit. My agent called next, then my publicist, then reporters who had somehow gotten wind that something significant had happened during the helicopter shoot. I gave them all the same answer, no comment. But the real test came 3 days later, when the studio executives requested a meeting. They gathered in a conference room that overlooked the city where I had built my American dream. The seamen in expensive suits who had never risked anything more dangerous than a bad quarterly report. They wanted to know if I was still committed to making action films. If I could still be counted on to deliver the kind of authenticity that audiences expected from an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. Gentlemen, I told them, I've been thinking about authenticity, and I've realized that the most authentic thing I can do is admit that I'm not actually a machine. I'm not actually the Terminator. I'm a husband and father who happens to be very good at playing characters who don't have those responsibilities. One of them, I can't even remember which one, leaned forward with the expression of a man who smelled money slipping away. Arnold, your brand is built on being the guy who does what others won't. If you start playing it safe. I started playing it smart, I corrected. There's a difference. They didn't understand, of course. How could they? They had never hung from a helicopter by one arm, never felt the safety cable stretch and snap, never experienced that moment of perfect clarity when you realize that some things are more important than proving you're invincible. But Maria understood. That evening, As we sat on our back patio watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and orange, she took my hand and squeezed it gently. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "For what?" Finally admitting I'm not Superman. For choosing to be human. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent decades building a career on playing characters who were more than human. Conan the Barbarian, the Terminator, larger-than-life heroes who didn't know the meaning of fear or limitation. But the greatest role I would ever play, I realized, was the one that required no special effects, no stunt doubles, no death-defying sequences. The role of father, of husband, of man who understood that true strength sometimes meant knowing when not to use it. Years later, when Terminator 2 was released and became the biggest blockbuster of 1991, critics praised the film's groundbreaking effects and visceral action sequences. They wrote about the authenticity of the performances, the way the stunts felt real and immediate. What they didn't know was that the most dangerous stunt ever filmed for that movie would never be seen by anyone except a small crew in the desert and a director who still, to this day, believes I made a mistake. But I know better now. The mistake wasn't destroying that footage. The mistake was almost dying for it in the first place. Sometimes I think about that helicopter, about those 2 seconds when I was falling toward the desert with a snapped safety cable trailing behind me like a broken promise. I think about the hunger that had driven me to that moment. The relentless need to push further, risk more, prove that Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't have limits. That hunger is still there. It always will be. It's what made me a champion, what brought me to America, what gave me a life beyond anything that kid from Thal ever dared to dream. But now it's tempered by something stronger. The knowledge that the greatest victory isn't always the most dangerous one. These days, when Catherine and Christina ask me to tell them stories about making movies, I tell them about the craft of acting, about working with directors and other actors, about the technical challenges of creating believable characters. I don't tell them about trucks jumping over motorcycles or helicopters and broken safety cables. Not because those stories aren't exciting, but because I want them to understand something more important than excitement. I want them to understand that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's knowing what's worth being afraid of. And some risks aren't brave. They're just foolish. The secret mission that almost killed Arnold Schwarzenegger wasn't the helicopter stunt or the motorcycle jump or any of the death-defying sequences that never made it to the screen. It was something much quieter and much harder. Learning to say no to the voice that had driven me my entire life. The voice that whispered that enough was never enough. That mission is ongoing. Every day, I choose the difficult path of balance over the easier path of extremes, that I choose being present for the small moments over being legendary for the dangerous ones. I choose being a father my children can count on over being an action hero they can only watch from a distance. It's not the kind of mission that makes headlines or breaks box office records. But it's the most important one I've ever undertaken, and for the first time in my life, I know exactly how it ends. It ends with going home. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. That way, you'll always be with us discovering the secrets and untold sides of the most famous lives in history.